When I was a kid, I never had the chance to play Samurai Jack Shadow of a Coup, so I was really excited when I decided I was gonna make a video about the game. This game had the potential to be perfect for fans of the series, letting us step into Jack's shoes, or I guess sandals, as we beat the crap out of Aku's minions and the goatee wizard himself left and right. But did it actually live up to that potential, or does it fail spectacularly in the attempt? Hi, I'm Dr. Panda, one of the surprisingly large number of pandas who also knows martial arts, and in this video we'll be revisiting Samurai Jack Shadow of a Coup from 2004. Was it good? What's the story about? And what is the major problem that ends up affecting the game so drastically? Oh, and we'll also talk about the game's price when it came out because geez, they might have gone a little overboard. Let's get started. Samurai Jack Shadow of a Coup is a console game released in 2004, published by Sega and developed by Adrenium Games, which was a studio owned by Amaze Entertainment. They had become famous since the early 2000s for developing games based on IPs like Rugrats, Lord of the Rings, or Finding Nemo. So yeah, these guys had experience. This was the second Samurai Jack game after the Amulet of Time for Game Boy Advance just a year earlier, and the voices from the original series returned for this game. One interesting detail is that the game was released for PlayStation 2 and Gamecube, but not for Xbox. And I say that's interesting because a version for that console was planned, but never released. Although for some reason the title was still included in the official Xbox 360 backward compatibility list, which makes no sense. Now, the game is a mix between a beat-em-up and a platformer. You have to defeat enemies and jump across different surfaces to complete missions, while also collecting some interesting collectibles that we'll talk about in a bit. The game is divided into 4 areas: Village, Forest, Underground, and Aku City. Each one has between 4 and 5 levels, giving us a total of 18 levels and roughly 6 hours of gameplay, which honestly isn't that much, especially considering the price the game sold for when it first came out, but oh well. The controls are pretty simple and standard for games in these genres. You can perform strong and weak attacks, jump, double jump, and block. But the game also makes an effort to add elements that bring some freshness to the gameplay. For example, there's an attack system that's kinda similar to the Deadeye mechanic from Red Dead Redemption. You gain access to it once you fill your Zen meter, allowing you to slow enemies down in slow motion so you can hit them more easily without taking damage. It's an addition they didn't really have to include, and yet they did, which I can appreciate. Although, if I'm being honest, I think I only used it a bunch of times during the entire game. It looks cool, but it interrupts the flow and doesn't quite fit with Jack's agility and speed style, which are 2 of the most satisfying elements of the game. And that raises an important topic: pacing. More on that in a second. The game also has a combo system worth talking about. Basically, you have to hold down R1 and then input the button combination to perform your combos. And isn't it a little strange that you have to hold down R1? It felt unusual to me, and at first I assumed the game required this so you wouldn't perform combos accidentally since they trigger a small cutscene that could mess you up if you're in the middle of a platforming section. And by the way, these cutscenes look pretty cool and make the combo feel devastating, but they also have one very important flaw. Anyway, it turns out the reason you have to hold R1 isn't to prevent accidental combos. I discovered the real reason in the second level of the game, where you learn that R1 is the block button, and you probably already see where this is going. You see, the game makes you hold down the block button while performing combos so that you can input the combo buttons without being hit by enemies. And in retrospect, that makes sense. There are certain enemies that spam attacks, which would make it nearly impossible to complete combos without being interrupted by the character's damage animation. I think this is fairly clever, and it's the kind of design decision that makes me feel like there was real care put into the game, or at least in some aspects of it, but we'll get to the story in a bit. However, this is a double-edged samurai sword, because in the game's attempt to avoid punishing the player too much, it ends up overcompensating. I say this because the combo system is basically rigged. How so, you ask? Well, the reason is that it makes you practically invincible while performing combos, almost encouraging you to spam these moves over and over whenever there's an enemy in sight. Oh, and for the next video, I'm torn between revisiting the Madagascar game or the KND one, so let me know in the comments which one you'd like to see. Earlier I mentioned that the combo cutscenes have a major flaw, and once again, it comes down to pacing. Every time you perform a combo, you essentially lose control of the character because the game forces you to watch these cool but unskippable cutscenes that last about 2 or 3 seconds, which end up slowing down the otherwise very satisfying flow of the game. Now, throughout the game, you'll also find collectibles. One of them is relics, which are these glowing green statues that basically act as the game's currency, and which you can trade in for more health, attack power, or ammo in the game's hub. Because yes, each world has its own hub where you choose which mission to play, which reminds me a lot of the cantina in LEGO Star Wars, minus the random bar brawls, the bartender, and pretty much all the cool parts. Also, something kinda absurd about upgrading your stats is that you can't actually see how many relics you have until after you've already agreed to spend them, which can be pretty inconvenient. The second collectible type is the one I have more issues with, though. It's the locals captured by a coup, who you'll find throughout the missions locked inside cages. You free them by destroying said cages, but the problem is that every time you rescue one, the game triggers a cutscene of them saying thank you and escaping. And I mean it, every single time. Not only does it interrupt the game's pacing once again, but it also doesn't really add much. In fact, I think the only reason the cutscenes exist is to allow the NPCs to disappear without it looking awkward in-game. But the cost is just too high. That said, there is actually a reason why rescuing the locals is worth it. But before that, I noticed that while most of the time when you talk to the NPCs they have voice dialogue, sometimes that's not the case, and you're left just reading the silent text box instead. This isn't the only game where that happens, but it definitely feels awkward at the very least. So far, I've mentioned 3 situations where the game's otherwise excellent pacing gets interrupted, and I think one of the main gameplay problems lies exactly there. Quick, turn on the notification bell. You see, the game has an impressive, almost melodic flow of sword slashes, jumps, and platforming that's incredibly satisfying. But because of that, every element that forces you to stop even for just a few seconds ends up feeling more like an annoyance than something that actually adds value to the experience. Now, I want to clarify that combat isn't limited to just swinging your sword. In fact, the game includes several types of weapons to the point where I almost feel like I'm in GTA with how much variety there is. Okay, maybe not that much, but it's still a good variety. So, the standard weapon is the sword, but there are also 2 long-range options. Shurikens, which you throw by pressing triangle, and the bow and arrow, for which the game even includes a first-person aiming system that feels surprisingly satisfying to use. But that's not all, because even for the sword, there are 3 varieties based on the elements: flame, lightning, and crystal. These allow you to perform special attacks, but more importantly, they look incredibly cool. And here's where rescuing the locals comes in handy, because that's exactly how you gain access to these sword variations. You can also find armor by destroying crates, which lets you withstand more attacks. And I have to say, Jack looks adorable wearing it. Plus, there's also a really nice touch here because you'll notice that as Jack takes damage, the armor gradually becomes more dented. Which is funny because there are several other objects and even some enemies in the game that simply disappear instantly when destroyed instead of having an animation or even a simple fade out like these chairs here. And before getting into the story, which I have quite a lot to say about, I want to talk about the platforming because honestly, I've seen much worse. I'm looking at you, Kids Next Door Operation video game. It's solid enough. It's not perfect, but it's not overly frustrating either. And the camera doesn't get in your way like it happens in a lot of other games. In fact, I had a lot of fun jumping from one platform to the next. I do think, however, that the character's shadow while jumping isn't very accurate, and you can't rely on it too much. That can certainly be a problem in a 3D game like this because the shadow should be your main ally when making tricky jumps between platforms, and that doesn't necessarily happen here. As for the story, oh man, the story. While reading reviews of the game after playing for several hours, I was surprised to learn that the developers worked side by side with Genndy Tartakovsky, the creator of Samurai Jack, to write the game's story. And I say I was surprised because his involvement really doesn't show in the story at all. This is in fact my main complaint about the game. The story is almost non-existent and can be summarized in just a few sentences. Basically, Jack is searching for the time portal, and to do that, the game uses a very common trope from that era. The protagonist saves one character after another in order to obtain clues that bring him closer to the portal. For example, in the first world, you have to rescue the priest. So you complete the 3 missions, eventually defeat the final bosses, and save him. Supposedly, he's got information about the time portal, but when Jack asks him questions, the guy tells us that we need to speak with another character in the second world who can help us, and so on, with this cycle repeating itself pretty much until the end of the game. Now, I understand that this is the easiest way to structure the story in a game that uses a world-based progression system, but still, it's impossible to deny that it feels lazy and uninspired. Though at least we got to fight Mad Jack. If something motivates you to keep playing, it definitely won't be the story. This also goes hand in hand with the fact that there are very few cutscenes throughout the game's narrative, which feels like a missed opportunity. Although maybe that's just a personal thing because I've always had a soft spot for 3D cutscenes based on 2D cartoons. Yeah, when I was a kid, the thing I loved most about licensed games was seeing the story cutscenes every time. Okay, so what's the verdict? In its review from 20 years ago, GameSpot described the game as pure mediocrity and accused it of being utterly forgettable. And to that, I have to say that I actually enjoyed it. In fact, I enjoyed it more than I expected, though we'll get to the game's price in just a second because that could change everything. Overall, the game has a good pacing and balance between beat-em-up combat and platforming, and I think it has the perfect level of difficulty, especially considering that its target audience was us 20 years ago. It's not a game where you're constantly gonna die, but at the same time, it does require a certain level of effort to get through the levels, particularly when it comes to the platforming, which I think is quite well done. Plus, the combat is fluid, and I even found myself going out of my way to get rid of an enemy or two who weren't really in my path just for the sheer pleasure of doing it, and I think that's a real strength of the game. So I say give it a try if you haven't. Now, the game is definitely not worth the price it sold for when it first came out, which was $39.95. But if you can get your hands on it for less, or even nothing, wink wink, I think it's worth it. And speaking of classic Cartoon Network shows, do you remember that fighting game based on the grim adventures of Billy and Mandy? A game that included 8 stages, a story mode, which I also have a lot to say about and not necessarily good things, and 15 playable characters, or maybe more as you might discover if you click. I made a video about it and you can check it out right here. Subscribe for more. Dr. Panda out.